theory, because it seems that much of the training that doctors receive is based around what is just a theory, and a theory, of course, is something that's not been proven. It's a hypothesis. It's somebody's idea. But germ theory is credited to Louis Pasteur back in the 1860s, I think, who I've heard you say was a chemist and not actually a doctor. So he put forward this idea of how germs and bacteria and viruses work, and this would appear to be a fundamentally flawed axiom, as it turns out. And the problem with axioms is that so much gets built around them, and if they're accepted as a truth, then all kinds of layers get put on top of it. And by the time you've got to several layers down the line, nobody thinks to question whether the axiom was correct in the first place. And so most modern medicine seems to be built around the validity of the germ theory idea, doesn't it?
It does indeed. In fact, it is, as you say, the fundamental building block of the whole medical system. You know, you take that foundation stone away and the whole house of cards falls down. And really, that's what we found, and you're quite right. It is still called a germ theory, i.e. something that's not proven, which, as we look back, and we went back into the history of it again, which is detailed in the book, we went back into it, and yes, although the germ theory was starting to be put together before Pasteur's time, which is, as you say, about 150 years ago, various people had looked at some sort of theory to try and come up with what was making people ill. But at the time, they only had optical microscopes, so they could only see certain things within the bloodstream. And at that time, it was the things they could see were bacteria. And that was where they made their first fundamental mistake, because whenever you looked into the blood through an optical microscope, wherever there was sort of dead or dying tissue, there was clusters of bacteria around it. And so they made the assumption that it was the bacteria that was attacking the cells and was obviously therefore causing the illness. But that is just not the case. And as we point out in the book, it's akin to blaming firemen for house fires just because you always see them clustered around a house fire. You know, so they just made that fundamental mistake. And lots of things started to be built on that. Lots of sort of medical practices started to be built on that of, okay, well, we've got to find something to kill this bacteria. And they caused all sorts of problems and made people ill and or killed people as well with the things that they started to do. And then in the 1930s onwards, they invented the electron microscope so that they could see even smaller particles within the blood. And then they saw these other things, which they named viruses, which is a corruption of a Latin word. Originally, virus meant poison or toxic material. So they've sort of corrupted it and started to use it to call these little particles, which are actually just protein, tiny protein particles. But again, they made the assumption that these were the things that were, if they found them in the blood, that these were the things that were causing illnesses. But they never did any of the basic tests, and they still don't do it today, where they've actually proved that. You know, there's three standard things that they need to do really to prove whether a virus is the cause of a disease, and that is to firstly isolate it, then take an electron micrograph of it, and then to determine what its genetic makeup is, to fully categorize what its genetic makeup is, and then to be able to prove that that particular isolated virus is the cause of the disease that is attributed to it. But they've never done that, ever. And that again was a great shock, and that's the same today, and they've certainly never done it with this present situation that we're in, you know, and you can challenge, and we do challenge anyone to produce those papers. And it's not, well, as I mentioned earlier, Gary Mullis, you know, a scientist, a true scientist, looked for those for the HIV/AIDS fiasco, and they weren't there. And as we've often said to people, you know, being able to produce and get your name on an original paper to prove this virus does this is, you know, it's a big deal within the medical establishment. You know, they get all sorts of honours and promotions and extra money and go down in the Hall of Fame in the medical establishment. So, if anybody had done this for any virus, their names would be there and those papers would be easy to find, and they're not. So that's the first clue that, well, if these papers don't exist, that means the work's not been done. And if the work's not been done, what on earth are they basing all these things on? What are they basing vaccinations on, which is supposed to prevent you getting a virus? What are they basing the various medicines they give to people, which is supposed to kill these viruses, when they've never isolated one and they've never proved that one actually causes anything? And this is an amazing thing. But of course, certain individuals, certain families, and we're going right back to the beginning, and we're going back to, say, the Rockefeller family and their petroleum industry, started to realize that there was money to be made in all of this. And that's why, as today, most pharmaceutical products are petroleum based when you look into them, and there's a very good reason for that. And of course, the pharmaceutical companies own, either wholly or partially, all the medical training schools. So you start to see why doctors' training is based around prescribing drugs, which the pharmaceutical companies manufacture.
Absolutely.
So you can quite see why we're in the dreadful situation that we're in today.
All right, let me hit you with a really big question, and Dawn, maybe you want to take this. This is very pertinent to the times in which we find ourselves as well. Is there any